Welcome back to the CyberVault. Today I'm excited to be joined by Aaron Mendes. Aaron is the CEO and co-founder of PrivacyHawk. PrivacyHawk is a platform that gives individuals real control over their personal data in an age of digital surveillance. From big tech to data brokers, Aaron's on a mission to help people reclaim their privacy and reshape how we think about data rights. We're going to unpack a few different things in this episode, from the real risks of personal data exposure, why privacy regulations feel broken, and how both individuals and CISOs can take back control before it's too late. Aaron, an absolute pleasure to have you here with me today. Why don't you kickstart and maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself and what it is that you're up to at PrivacyHawk?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Katie. Excited to be here. So yeah, my name's Aaron Mendes, CEO and co-founder of PrivacyHawk. So PrivacyHawk is a consumer application that helps people protect their personal data from falling into the wrong hands. We've built a suite of tools that use agentic AI to identify all the various places that your personal data is exposed. That could be corporate databases, data brokers, the dark web, and gives you automation and control over who still has that data, ultimately reducing your digital footprint, which is the sum total of all the places that your personal data resides, which reduces your risk of scams, spam, identity theft, and fraud. Because that's really, our personal data is really the root cause of how fraudsters and criminals get a hold of your personal data and ultimately compromise accounts to steal money. So we're focused on people prevent that, but also at the same time protecting a fundamental right, which is our privacy and our personal data, which is pretty central to our security and our our own kind of self, I guess, self image.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And I think such an important topic, because let's be honest, it doesn't matter who you are, this impacts you. If you've got some form of digital footprint, at least, which I'm pretty certain most people do these days. What I want to kickstart with, Aaron, I just want to get back to the basics and back to the beginning, because if we look at personal data exposure, could you tell me a bit more about what do you actually mean by this, and what are the risks that people are facing that they may be kind of unaware of, or are aware of but don't necessarily realize how at risk they are?
Yeah, sure. So personal data is all the information about you. This is financial information, tax IDs, logins, name, address, family members. Everything that can be known about you is your personal data. And the vast majority of that information we're giving out all day long as we use the internet. Every time you make a purchase, every time you sign up for something, every time you use a website, you're creating this trail of sensitive digital information about you. And that information doesn't just disappear when you're done using a service. They keep that information and they use it to market to you or to provide the service. And if you think about over the years, how many different websites and services you've touched, it's in the hundreds, if not thousands. And then you have this whole ecosystem of third-party service providers and data brokers that are mining and selling and sharing that information. So your personal data footprint, your digital footprint, just balloons into this massive uncontrollable web of sensitive information that's exposed all over the place. And for the average person, it's pretty much impossible to go get a handle on where all that data is and do anything about it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the risk is that the data falls into the wrong hands. And this is really, like I was saying earlier, the root cause of why everybody gets so many spam texts and calls, why there's so many scams and fraud and identity theft, is because criminals, it's so easy for them to get a hold of sensitive personal information and then exploit it to compromise our accounts and steal our money.
Yeah. And I think kind of that really sets in the reality here, because you can, when you put it out and paint the picture as clearly as you just did there, you are really putting into perspective that your digital footprint, even just as a typical individual who's probably just surfing the internet, as on social media, buying whatever it may be, online banking, for example, you've probably got a pretty significant digital footprint without even realizing it. And I think kind of people can think that maybe, oh, I'm changing my passwords or I'm doing X, Y, and Z and I'm helping reduce my footprint, but not necessarily realizing that actually their data is not protected, that, okay, just because you've created an account somewhere and then deleted that online shopping account, it doesn't mean that that password or that email address isn't still out there and accessible. So, I mean, again, kind of to dive a little bit deeper, or what are the realities here? Like, how can people, at least to the best of their ability, manage this so their footprint is as probably as minimal as possible?
Right. So ultimately, what you want to be doing is exercising your privacy rights. So, and that's really the foundation that 150 countries now have created for individual internet users is we have a right to have control over our personal data. And so that's the fundamental that's the fundamental component that gives us the ability to do something about it, is that you have the right to ask companies to delete your data. You have a right to ask companies to tell you what data they have about you. You have a right to restrict them from selling it or sharing it with third parties. And you also have other rights, like to not be discriminated against based on your personal data. But the one that we're talking about here, as it regards to your digital security, is really stopping your data from being shared and sold, and having it deleted when it's no longer needed. So at the end of the day, if you're not in the database and there's a breach, you're not going to be one of the victims of that breach. And so if you're in hundreds or thousands of databases, that is a huge attack surface, which is what cybersecurity professionals call, all the different ways that somebody could compromise you. And, if you're in hundreds of databases, that's hundreds of attack vectors. And so you want to reduce that. And so the question is how do you reduce it? Well, these privacy rights give us the ability to go track down all the companies that we gave our data to in the past, and also go to data brokers and request that they stop selling or sharing our data. The tricky part is that that's extremely time consuming. You'd have to go to hundreds of different companies, read their entire privacy policy, try to find what their process is. There's no standard process. Some of them have an email address. Some of them you have to send a letter to. Some of them you have to fill out a complicated web form. And then you have to keep track of all this. You could try to make like an Excel sheet or something, or a Google sheet to do it. But at the end of the day, the reason why so few people are taking advantage of this is it's just completely overwhelming to try to get a handle on, like, even going to try to find all the companies that you gave your data to. Like, how do you remember some purchase that you made 5 years ago and the company's still sitting on your login for that website and all that information? So what we do as a company, and not to be self-promotional, but there's other companies that do this, so just find any one of them, is find a company, a service that automates identifying all these exposures. It's like most problems, technology can help solve the problem. And so it's great that there's these regulations that give us these rights, but the regulations didn't make it easy for people to actually exercise the rights. And so the businesses that have to comply with these regulations don't really put a ton of effort into making it really easy. And nobody's come together and made any sort of standard process where you can easily even find all the companies that have your data, let alone make mass requests. So there's various tools out there that you can find that will identify data brokers and also corporate and first party data relationships, and then use automation to send all those requests for you, to ultimately reduce the number of companies and data brokers and third parties that are still sitting on sensitive information of yours.
Yeah. And I think kind of the one thing that you started off kind of touching base on at the beginning of that is privacy regulations can kind of feel a bit overcomplicated and overwhelming. Like you say, I mean, tracking it down, that's where using something like PrivacyHawk is extremely valuable, because nobody really has that time to be able to sit there and go through all the past purchases. So the amount of times you can easily just set up an online account for a shop where you don't even buy anything. How can you remember that you've set that up if you don't immediately action it afterwards? But the problem being, I think a lot of people don't necessarily actually know what their rights are when it comes to privacy regulations. And they also don't know that it can vary dependent on, where they are or who they're purchasing with. I mean, that obviously naturally puts you more at risk of being in a breach because you're not really doing that much, I suppose, to kind of counteract it. So I mean, why do you think this is, and do you think there's a way that we can kind of help simplify it for people, for them to kind of realize, look, here are some standard things that you're really entitled to? Because I think kind of when you cookies are a prime example. Everybody just accepts them, thinking that you have to. Whereas a lot of the time, you can reject them. You don't have to let them track just that piece of information. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, sure. So, like most, government regulations that give us rights, ultimately at the end of the day, there's a partnership, or it's kind of not really a partnership, but, the private sector steps in a lot of times and helps fill the gaps. And so, uh, the government gives us various, human rights like privacy. And then it's up to businesses in the private sector many times to create tools that make it easy for people to exercise those rights. And that's like some of the tools that I was talking about. So if we want to start with what rights you actually have, like I was saying before, and it does vary based on where you live, but the right to delete your data and to not have your data sold is in all the regulations. Like there's a lot of nuance to the various regulations, but there's some common threads. So if you live in one of these 150 countries, which is you probably do, that have a regulation, it's highly likely that you have a right to request that your data be deleted. And so that's something that we have a right to do. And why is it so complicated? Because every country has their own politics and has to make their own laws, and those laws are complicated and have to be different for each country and their legal regulations. But fundamentally, you probably have a right, depending on where you live, to delete your data.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to know, because I think kind of, not everybody really is aware of, I suppose the fact that they are in control of their own personal data. I think sometimes you just think, oh, it's out there.
Yeah.
That's not something I can influence or I have control of, or that like we say, that it's my right to say, actually, I don't want you to have that anymore. What I think would actually be really interesting, Aaron, because we've really looked at the impacts just from the day-to-day perspective. But if we kind of dive into, let's say, from a CISO's side of things, because often CISOs are in a role where they've not only got their employee data to protect, but they've also got customer data to protect. And we've touched base on what it's like when you're, say, a kind of, if you're shopping online, you're giving your data to that kind of that customer or that shop or whatever you want to call it. But then the CISO of that company then obviously has a responsibility that once they've got hold of that data, they've also, they don't want to be at risk of letting there be a breach or anything like that. So if we're to kind of flip the coin there, what do you think some of the risks or vulnerabilities are when you're looking at kind of more of the third party side of things?
Yeah, so I do not envy the CISOs of big companies that have millions of customers and thousands of vendors and tens of thousands of employees. It's a daunting job. It's a massive attack surface, and at, at the end of the day, the most vulnerable attack surface is people.
Yeah.
It's your employees, it's your customers, it's hackers and criminals, and then all these third parties that you have to have relationships with to run your business. So if you think about the you know the attack surface there, it's huge, and where third party risk comes in. So most CISOs know that about half of compromises come from third party vendor risk, which is basically, if you're a big company and you have 10,000 employees and 10 million customers, you're using thousands of vendors, accounting software, sales software, email software, servers, security software, all kinds of stuff. And then you have thousands of employees, and they each have to have accounts with all these different services. And these are all third-party companies. So it's the number of attack vectors to your own company is thousands of times larger with these third-party vendors than it is with your own company, because you have control over what your own company uses. You don't really have much control over what all these third parties are doing. And even if they do have great security practices, there's just so many of them that inevitably one of them is going to get compromised. So let's just take, your accounting software. Let's say you're using some SaaS solution. They have all of your financial information, and maybe your whole finance team has to have a login to that. Well, what if they get compromised? Now, all of your financial information and a whole bunch of employees' credentials have been leaked, and the hackers can use that to compromise your company. And so we call this your organizational digital footprint. And it's kind of like a personal digital footprint, but for a business. It's all the places that have that business's sensitive information that business doesn't really have direct control over. And what I think is an important security practice that I think has been is it's relatively new, so I think it's still being largely overlooked, is reducing your organization's digital footprint. How many of these accounts still need to be used? Like, it could be as many as 80 or 90% of the credentials and logins that your employees have created over the years aren't even being used anymore. And nobody is going back and deleting those accounts. But in most jurisdictions, there is the same rights for business employees to delete their accounts as there is for consumers. And businesses can use tools to identify all of those and go start deleting all those old accounts. It sounds very simple, but imagine if you go and find, 80 to 90% of the logins and accounts that your employees created over the years. Let's say you have 1,000 employees. That could be like 300,000 accounts. That's a huge attack surface that you could just eliminate, just wipe it off the table with, some simple automation to go identify those companies and just use an AI agent to just go start deleting those accounts. They're not being used anymore.
Yeah, I think that, and you kind of touch base on the fact that there's obviously a huge attack surface there, and the larger the enterprise or the larger your customer base, I suppose you don't always need to be a massive enterprise to have a huge kind of customer base as well. And I think kind of it really drives that piece of education. Like, do companies realize how much of an attack surface they're allowing themselves to have because they're not managing or they're not streamlining these processes to then say, oh, if we don't need to use this, then let's make sure our data's all clear of it. I mean, what do you think we need to do to help close this gap here? Like, how can we make sure that kind of this is really on the forefront of people's minds? Because like you said, most of the vulnerability, or at least most of the reasons for a data breach, half the time is down to the human side of things. It's the people that are the biggest vulnerabilities. So what do we need to do to help drive this educational piece?
Yeah, I mean, just talking about it like we are, I do a lot of advocacy in this area. I recently published an article in Forbes about it because I had been seeing Wall Street Journal and New York Times and other major publications writing articles about how individuals can go delete themselves from the web, but they focused on the open web, which is only a tiny sliver of the pie of our total digital footprint. And I ultimately used deep research to go see if any major publications had written anything in the last 5 years about how people can exercise their privacy rights, and none of them have. And it was really surprising to me how little attention this is getting. And I think it's because it's just so new and people aren't thinking about it on a daily basis. But as far as businesses go, they're doing a lot of good stuff. And this is just something that is a new tool for them that I don't think they had been thinking about, but they're starting to think about it more. And I think at the end of the day, it just, people like me and you just need to talk about it and make CISOs and other security professionals aware that this is something that they have a right to do, and that if they did do it, it would significantly reduce their attack surface.
Absolutely. And I think often it's the conversation that at least starts the snowball effect. And well, kind of, Aaron, for anybody that's listening, because I think kind of whether it's, whether it's kind of a day-to-day person on the street, a security professional, or a CISO themselves that's heading up an enterprise, or even just kind of, a business where they recognize that maybe this vulnerability is something that they've not looked at before. How can people reach out? How can they get connected, find out a bit more about what you're doing at PrivacyHawk, and see if there's maybe an opportunity for being supported on some of the stuff that they need here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm easily accessible on LinkedIn. People can find me there, but also privacyhawk.com is our website, and they can feel free to go there and reach out to us that way.
Awesome. Well, honestly, Aaron, this has been a great conversation. I think it's undeniable how valuable it really is to kind of start considering data privacy in particular. I mean, it's something that everybody looks at. We see how much of an impact data breaches can have on businesses, but also on people. And I think it's about time that it's really taken seriously, I suppose. So it's been great to have this conversation and talk some real truths here. So, I mean, to our listeners, as always, do not forget to subscribe. Make sure to share this episode with your security peers. Get connected with us on LinkedIn. But that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. And Aaron, again, thank you so much for joining us. But I'll see you next time for more conversations shaping cyber.